Well, finally, I've got round to Series 6 of the Autosport Top 10s. It's taken me way too long to get to this point. Series 5 was BTCC related last year, but this time, it seems appropriate. We've got 75 years of Formula 1 World Drivers' Championship. It's back to F1, and this one is going to be Top 10 F1 driver rivalries. And joining me to, well, probably take this list apart, because the more I look at it, the more I question it myself, is racing driver, F1 pundit and all-round motorsport historian Karun Chandhok. Welcome to the podcast. Are you ready to rip this list to pieces?
Well, you only sent it to me yesterday, and I only replied to you, starting to poke holes in it, but it'll be a good debate for people.
Yeah, it should be. It should be. I mean, we've done this a couple of times before. We did a Williams one. I think we all agreed probably too much.
And McLaren.
We did a McLaren one where we had quite a nice level of disagreement. I fear this one. Yeah.
Well, no, I think. Well, let's see. We'll see.
Let's get into it then. So this is the criteria here. We can talk about how we might grade this slightly different. For me, is a certain level of intensity, I think, to it. How many on-track and championship battles were there? How long did they go on for? I think it needs to be at the front of the field, really. I think we're talking about some of the biggest names in the sport. But I think we'll probably get into perhaps some of the nitty-gritty of the criteria as we go along, and we'll see if we differ a little bit. So I'll start with number 10, and then you can throw in some other honourable mentions that aren't in the list that perhaps could have taken 10. So in at 10 is Lewis Hamilton versus Nico Rosberg. 8 titles between them. Obviously not when they were racing against each other necessarily, but I think this is at number 10 for me because it was quite intense, especially in 2016, but it can't go any higher really because I don't think it was a particularly even contest. I think most of us would regard Lewis Hamilton as one of the greatest F1 drivers of all time, whereas I don't think Nico would get quite that high, but he was sort of nipping at his heels for his entire career, wasn't he, all the way through from karting. They had a few clashes on track. Normally, Rosberg, I would say, was probably the aggressor. Normally. And, of course, he actually finally got that 2016 title and then retired, which infuriated Hamilton even more, didn't it? So that's why I put that in there. It was quite intense one. We needed it as well, didn't we? Because when they were at Mercedes for 2014 to 16, the first 3 years of the turbo hybrid era, it would have been tedious if one of them had been half a minute down the road every race, wouldn't it?
I think if we go back to just, you reflect on that period, it kind of felt like the culmination of this journey that they'd been on since they were kids. And, obviously they had such long history. And it's interesting, when you speak to Nico now, in sort of reflective mode that he's in. It's been 9 years now since he retired. And you realize, and also when you speak to people at Mercedes, you realize there was so much sort of underlying tension between the two of them, which stemmed from a childhood rivalry, really, going back to karts. And they weren't ever really in the same championship at the same time in junior categories. They sort of crossed paths at places like Macau, for example, but it didn't really happen till they became teammates in 2014. Because Nico really didn't have a top car till 2014. Lewis obviously had won his world championship and winning race at McLaren. And it kicked off, didn't it? Bahrain, that first race, it set the tone. Brilliant rivalry. Lewis emerging on top, which, as you say, we would all expect Lewis to emerge on top. But that rivalry was very intense. There was particularly in 2016, they were barely speaking, I imagine. It was a very, very intense rivalry. Austria when they collided, Spa they collided. Obviously Barcelona is the famous one that everyone remembers. But ultimately, if Lewis's engine hadn't blown up in Malaysia, would Nico have beaten him to the crown? The answer is probably no. But yeah, I think it definitely deserves a place in the top 10. So I'm actually going to agree with you because it was intense.
Yeah, I mean, it's one we could almost get into the criteria a little bit here as well. And what do you want to see in your rivalry? Do you want to see clashes? Because often the clashes that you remember, but actually I like Bahrain stands out to me as a great race. They were way ahead of everyone else, but it was an entertaining race because they raced each other fairly. I know Nico was a little bit upset at times, but actually it was a pretty fair fight. And the guy who was slower on the day won through better racecraft, basically.
Yeah, I think you've got to have a certain degree of head-to-head battles where they're racing and fighting each other on track. And then you're getting a direct rivalry in the wider picture of what's happening in the World Championship narrative. But I think you've got to see them race. You've got to, ultimately, you've got to see them go wheel to wheel and have a bit of a ding-dong. Whether they collide or not is immaterial. But I think also having that edge, that sort of intensity and a degree of almost genuine dislike between those two. And it might even be temporary dislike. They might kiss and make up later on. But I think that's important for when you classify, for me, defining a rivalry. There's got to be an
edge.
Yeah, it's got to be an edge to it. It can't just be, fighting on track and then hugging it out afterwards. That's not a rivalry. That's just a friendly little race.
So that actually supports my argument for not putting in Niki Lauda versus Alain Prost.
I think
which
so.
was a 1 year rivalry, because 85 it wasn't close at all. It was just 84, and Lauda, I mean, you could run that championship, I'd say 100 times, and Prost is world champion 99 times.
Yes, exactly.
So it didn't quite make it in for me, but I thought, should I put it in there? But actually they were almost too friendly. I can't think of any real... There weren't many wheel-to-wheel fights between them as such. They were just going about their races very differently.
And that's why I think you should kind of include... I would have included Schumacher versus Senna, actually, because although it's kind of the rivalry that was about to happen, but tragically never did, we forget, through 92 and 93, they had a lot of edgy battles. Don't forget Magny-Cours, they crashed into each other in 92. Testing, they were arguing with each other. There's that brilliant footage, isn't it, of Senna stomping down the pit lane and almost, grabbing Schumacher and having that argument. Even in 93, there were a few races, if you think of Kyle Army and Silverstone and stuff. Michael, there was definitely a rivalry that was building there. And weirdly, in 94, I think because, Senna had a difficult start to the season in Interlagos and Aida, the sting almost came out of it a bit, But yeah, I guess I would be absolutely top of the list of rivalries that didn't quite develop.
Yeah, that's why I didn't put it in, really. I didn't feel like it felt like it was just starting when it was cut short, a little bit like we never really got to see the Sterling Moss, Jim Clark fight. We didn't see Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart. They kind of just getting started when one of them crashed or was killed. So yeah, I didn't put it in there. But are there any other... I've got a couple of other honourable mentions before we move on to 9. So what else do you think could have maybe crept in? I
think when you look at the era when I fell in love with F1, late 80s, the early 90s, Prost, Senna, Mansell, Piquet were your 4 big stars, if you like. You then had the Bergers and the Lazies and Bootsons and Petres, they're sort of the next grade down. But they were the 4 big stars.
Yeah.
And actually, I think there are various combinations there, wasn't there? There's Senna, Prost, Mansell, Piquet, but you could also... There was a Mansell-Senna rivalry. Ever since they collided in Spa in 87, they sort of went on this roller coaster. They collided in Portugal and Estoril after Nigel had been black flagged. They had that fantastic wheel-to-wheel battle in Barcelona, 91. And then it all ended with a bang in Adelaide, where Senna basically nerfed him off the track. And... I think that there was a rivalry there. There was, and it went for a period of time, right? You go back to probably 86 when they started competing on equal.
Well, even
plane.
in 85, it was for Mansell's first win at Brands Hatch. There was a bit of Keke Rosberg had to get involved in that one, didn't he?
Yeah.
So, I must admit, for some reason, that I think just because I always think Senna Prost and Mansell Piquet, it didn't even come to my mind, but actually it was for quite a while.
And the same for Mansell Prost, actually, because even today you talk to Nigel and he's upset about what happened at Ferrari in 1990 and thinks Prost robbed him of a great deal of success there. And I think there was a bit of edge between Prost and Mansell as well. So yeah, in that 4, there's a few little permutations in that.
What a fantastic era that was, wasn't it?
Well, hang on. What about Senna and Piquet? They loathed each other.
I don't want to upset too many Piquet fans, but really, by the time Senna got going, Piquet wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't really much of an on-track rivalry, was there? Although there also is Hungary 86.
Hungary 86.
They move around the outside, which is phenomenal. We've gone off piece there.
Sorry, we've gone way off piece. This is going to be a running theme, I feel.
Yeah. We should have got a couple of points on the table as well, shouldn't we? So honourable mentions for me that I didn't put in, unless you had any more. Have you got any others?
No. I'll refrain.
Juan Manuel Fangio and Alberto Ascari, I think, but they were kind of in apart from in 1951, one of them had a big car advantage, and then obviously Ascari was killed in a sports car race. It never really got going. Jackie Stewart, Emerson Fittipaldi, I think.
Yeah, quite friendly though, wasn't it?
Quite friendly. I think the only time they hit each other was on the slowdown lap at Monaco by accident. So not sure where that counts. And also, I think Stewart probably was a bit better. I think he loses 72 partly because he's ill.
Yes,
and then it's 4-1.
Yeah.
Well, actually, not even the one, was it? Because he's 74 title game after he's retired. And then the other one I suggested that you could argue maybe this could have gone on longer was Fernando Alonso, Mark Schumacher. As Alonso, the person that actually went toe-to-toe in a title fight with Schumacher and came out on top, which hadn't happened for a long time by the time he got to it, because obviously he wasn't in the 05 fight. So he didn't quite make it in.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think at that one, I'd say it was really only 1 year, wasn't it? It was it was 2006.
It was almost more of a generational, metaphorical handover than a rivalry. Just before we move on to number 9, what do you reckon the next one's going to be? Are we looking at Piastri Verstappen?
I think it's bubbling up for that, isn't it? You know, the only thing is, with the new regulations coming in 2026, with Mercedes potentially being strong, are we looking at Russell Verstappen? Or are we looking at I wouldn't discount Russell in there, because he's shown he's prepared to get stuck in and also have the off-track, water words
there.
Yeah, he's willing to have that off-track water words, which I think actually a lot of these big rivalries need and have had. So I wouldn't discount a bit of. I feel like Leclerc is just a bit too nice, nobody's going to have that enormous argument with him. But I could see there's a Piastri, Verstappen, Russell thing bubbling away there.
Yeah. We don't know where Antonelli's going to slide. Maybe that's the one after the next one. He's on his way, isn't he? But well, we're talking about needle off track. Number 9, Alan Jones versus Nelson Piquet. So I think it's almost a forgotten, maybe not forgotten rivalry, but I think Alan Jones is a bit underrated. Probably didn't hang around long enough. Obviously, he came on strong at the end of 79 at the same time that Piquet's impressing as a youngster at Brabham. Then they have their fight in 1980 and Jones wins that. 81, Jones should have been in the title fight but wasn't, and Piquet gets the title. And then it should have carried on, I think. I think Jones should have hung around at Williams and then we could have gone again. But
well, especially if you think the 82 car was a good car. I mean, 82 was a weird year, obviously, right? You know, so many people, on reflection, you could say could have and should have been world champion that year. Obviously, Villeneuve, Pironi, obvious standouts. But ultimately, Rosberg won the championship in the car that Jones was so familiar with and helped to develop. So you could argue if Jones had stuck around, he would have been a title contender. You know, there's a strong argument for Jones being a title contender and potentially having won, those 4 championships between 79 and 82 with a bit more luck and a bit more reliability and things falling his way. But yeah, I think there was a bit of needle here, wasn't it? They
didn't like each other.
Definitely,
yeah. Practical joke at Piquet, and Jones is a no-nonsense kind of guy. My favourite story, I think, there is the 81 Monaco Grand Prix, when they've already had needle from the previous race, and Jones is coming up after Piquet after overtaking Villeneuve's Ferrari, and then Piquet bins it. And I think Alan said it's the only time in a race car he's ever laughing out loud as he drove past. But there was definite needle there, wasn't there?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, two sort of old school racing characters in some ways, wasn't it? They weren't opposed to having that bit of gamesmanship and sort of psychological gamesmanship. You think of Jones, Reutemann, the games that he was able to bury Reutemann, wasn't he, psychologically?
Very strong mentally, wasn't he, Jones?
Yeah, and actually Piquet, so was Piquet. If you think of later on Piquet versus other teammates, that's where he tried every trick of the book.
Spoiler alert!
Yeah. So Yeah, no, it was a fun rivalry for that period, and in at the time two really good teams in an era where there were many good teams actually who could have, there was Ferrari and Ligier and on occasion Renault. They were sort of coming along, weren't they, towards the end? But yeah, there was. They were in good cars, but by no means like dominant cars. They were in the fight.
Maybe that's why the rivalry doesn't hang in the mind quite so much, because it wasn't the only defining part of that era.
Yes.
There's quite a lot going on. So.
Unlike the Nico Lewis, which was basically
that was it.
That was it.
Well, number 8. So I actually did this list a few years ago, and I've sort of revised it a little bit, and I can justify this revision because number 8 is Max Verstappen versus Lewis Hamilton, which I had higher up the list when I did it in late 2021, early 2022, for obvious reasons, because 2021 I think will go down as one of the most intense championship fights in F1 history. The reason I didn't have it high is because I do like my rivals to be able to go through a corner side by side together and come out of it occasionally, as opposed to always end up in the gravel. And I got very frustrated as a spectator in 2021. Like, come on, you can do better than this, guys.
Yeah,
but there's no questioning the intensity of the fight.
Yeah, I mean, your love letter to Max is still, out there.
Yes,
To read.
yeah. I get reminded of that. I stand by all those words, though. Although it wasn't Max that ruined the Abu Dhabi finale, was it?
No,
that was just what I expected, but it wasn't actually anything to do with Verstappen.
No, exactly. I think for me, the reason this doesn't go higher up the list is absolutely not because of intensity, because it was incredibly intense. I don't think any rivalry on our list, certainly, or within F1, has been under that level of scrutiny because of just the advent of social media, Netflix, and the number of eyeballs now on F1 across the digital platforms as much as television. You go back to even Nico versus Lewis. Yes, there was a bit of social media and internet stuff, but it wasn't anything like it was by the time we got to 2021. And I remember being on the grid, even in the build-up to that Abu Dhabi weekend, and it was so intense. Every weekend you'd arrive at the track and you're going, God, what's going to happen now? What? And we forget how many moments of madness there were between, obviously, the Monza, Silverstone were the big explosions, but Saudi Arabia was crazy, Brazil was crazy,
Imola.
There was so much that went on.
I think it's one of those where the level of the driving was incredibly high in terms of when they were doing their qualifying laps and the rest of it, but the level of the racing wasn't good enough because it was too intense and they didn't keep it together enough. Jeddah was like a race. I called it a race of disgrace, I think.
Yeah, it was madness. It was complete madness. But you're right, because they won, was it 18 out of 22 races that year? It was incredible. The standard that the two of them were setting was incredibly high in terms of just outright speed and it got so intense between the teams, right? There was it was building up to like this level of hatred almost between the two
leaving
camps.
people out in the pit lane to make them drive around each other and doing all sorts of silly little things.
But the only thing I would say about, and I think you're right not to put it, because more recent listeners would look at it and go, well, surely it's got to be higher, because 2021 will go down as one of the most dramatic, controversial seasons in F1 history. It's probably got to be in the top 3. I'm sure we'll do that list another time.
Yeah, you'll do. I'll put a note.
Yeah. But it kind of was a one-year wonder, because Mercedes never turned up to the party in the new regs.
That's the trouble. The sort of years running up to 21, you know that Verstappen's coming.
Yeah.
Hamilton and Mercedes are too on top of their game for it to be more than the occasional skirmish. And Hamilton usually has his eye on the bigger prize and goes, yeah, okay, Max, you can have that one. I'm not going to fight it. And then since then, the Mercedes wasn't really in it. And now Lewis is probably past his best, isn't he? I suspect, even if he gets a good Ferrari.
Exactly. And I think ultimately it comes down to, we're so fortunate that the regulations changed by a few millimeters on the rear floor. That was it. It was a slight tweak to the regulations around the rear floor, which all of a sudden seemed to be enough to swing the balance just to bring Mercedes back a bit and Red Bull forward a bit, that allowed that switch from 2020 to 2021 and have this incredible season.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Okay, I'm pleased that I've put that in there. I think that works okay. But so number 7, we're going back much further. Number 7. Now, I don't think there's a huge amount of needle here, but I think just the sheer consistency of being the top 2 drivers across a period gets them onto this. So number 7 is Jim Clark versus Graham Hill, 4 titles between them, and they finished in the top three separate occasions, 62, 63 and 65. They were both in the title fights in 64 and 67, and I know at Lotus it's 4-0 in 1967 for Clark over Hill, but actually Graham Hill had an incredibly unlucky season with the Lotus 49 that did fall apart more often than not, which is why neither of them won the championship. But I felt it had to be there because they're sort of a defining duo over the 1960s, really.
I think they epitomised how teammates can be incredibly competitive, chasing the top prize in their sport. And, looking, as always, as competitive people do, for hidden advantages, I'm sure, within themselves or within their side of the team, but respectfully. And that's what you got the impression, right? Is, right through until, until Hockenheim 68, when Clark was killed. But throughout that period, as teammates, yeah, it was respectful, wasn't it? You felt like they, each one respected the other one's abilities. I think, by all accounts, obviously it was long before I was born, but from everything I've read and heard from people around there, Clark had a lot of respect for Hill's ability as a developer of the car and the feedback and how he his sort of engineering brain. I think Graham Hill was quite famous for. I think everyone in that era acknowledged that Jim Clark was the fastest racing driver of that era, arguably of any era, the greatest racing driver. And you kind of get the feeling that Graham Hill was okay with that because he was secure enough in knowing, well, actually, I can still win things, I can still do things, and I will do it my way. And he did, 5 Monaco wins, 2 world championships, an amazing record. And you kind of feel Graham Hill has gone, again, a bit underrated, under the radar, a bit like we were saying with Alan Jones.
Yeah, I mean, the rivalry course extended beyond F1. I mean, they battled for the Indy 500. In fact, I mean, actually, Fernando Alonso has done us a bit of a favour there because with his chasing of the Triple Crown, people have mentioned Graham Hill more than they perhaps would have done before. So, yeah, he gets a bit overlooked sometimes. But, he was the closest thing to a consistent challenger to Clark, I think. Okay, so we'll go on to number 6, Fernando Alonso versus Lewis Hamilton. Which I'd argue they in a way they've been around the longest, but the rivalry's only kind of been at bits of that because often Alonso hasn't been in a quick enough car. But obviously, I guess 2007 is what gets it this hard on the list when Lewis came into McLaren as a rookie and Alonso as double world champion. It all went a bit wrong quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, this is where my sort of 1 year theory falls apart a bit. And we could, you could sort of argue with ourselves, I think, on whether, because really you're right, 2007 was the one where it exploded. In 2010, 2012, they didn't really have that much. They had good races, but I don't think there was any sort of intense one-to-one rivalry because they were still fighting the Red Bull.
They were both the anti-Red Bull team, if you like, trying to stop Vettel winning.
Yeah. But, I mean, 2007 was an unbelievable year. I was racing in GP2 at the time, and I remember, we were all rooting for Lewis because I remember the whole GP2 paddock, he was there as the second GP2 champion, graduated straight into a top car in F1, and there was this real feeling of goodwill in the GP2 paddock that we all wanted him to do well because it reflected well selfishly on all of us racing in that series, and it was just brilliant to watch, wasn't it? And, all that stuff that went on outside the car as well. Budapest, 2007, that whole thing of Alonso, basically threatening to open the lid on the whole Spygate thing and all of that then unraveling. It was unbelievable.
That's one of the things I didn't want to put it any higher, though, because it was almost became Alonso versus the team. I've spoken to people at McLaren from the time. It's like he was just so paranoid about us. It wasn't even necessarily about Hamilton was the factor because he came in and was quicker than really was convenient, basically.
Yes.
But it's then the paranoia that created within the team that actually was Alonso's biggest problem. So that, in a way, pushes it a bit further down the list because it's not a direct intensity between the two drivers.
Yeah, I think so, but ultimately it did get intense, and also I think it fits my criteria in terms of the needle and the gamesmanship that went on outside the car. Think of Lewis sitting in Monaco in the press conference after the racing. I have number 2 on my car. I follow the team orders. Well, we all know secretly he was absolutely seething and raging and, all of that
And then that
sort of
upset
stuff.
Alonso that the implication was that he'd been allowed to win.
Yeah, basically. It was brilliant.
Yeah. Well, into the top 5 now. And number 5 is Michael Schumacher versus Damon Hill. Now, again, this is one of those where, in terms of ability, overall greatness, Schumacher's going to be up there in the top, let's say, 5, 10.
Yes.
Whereas Damon, probably not, 25, let's say. But he was, again, a little bit like his dad, was the one that was, the opposition to the benchmark driver after Ayrton Senna obviously was killed. Yeah. And actually gets a lot of kudos for even turning 1994 into a title fight when it looked like it was going to be a steamroller.
It's one of those rivalries which I felt was, it was defining, wasn't it, of the mid-1990s. It was a defining rivalry of that mid-1990s. But it was a rivalry that kind of happened so unexpectedly, because it was meant to be Senna versus Schumacher, the rivalry. This is what we were building up to through 92, 93, and this was going to be the Senna versus Schumacher. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, now what? And as you say, absolute credit to Damon, who picked up the team, picked up the battle, and then that carried on. You'd have to say, even into 96, there was there were a few moments where Schumacher almost seemed happy when Jacques was winning, or when it was anyone but Damon winning.
Even beyond that, I think in '98, there were moments where, and I remember at Canada, Michael weaved towards Damon for no reason. Like, there was obviously a bit. I feel like Schumacher almost didn't feel like Damon was worthy of the rivalry, and well, maybe until Suzuka '94. I think that must have registered with Schumacher then, and then of course he made him. And this is the other reason it's hard on this list, of course, is there was a title deciding clash at Adelaide, which as a kid at the time I thought, I'll give Michael the benefit of the doubt, and then I revised that after Jerez 97, which we come to later.
Yes, and I think also they had, you obviously had Monza and Silverstone 95, where, I think Damon will admit even now, he just absolutely nerfed Michael off on both occasions. But they were such different characters, such different backgrounds, such different characters, such different personalities, and it just made it a really fascinating dynamic between them. And the teams were different as well, wasn't it? Williams is sort of hardcore engineering-led team, and Benetton, the sort of plucky upstart trying to win their first world championship, and with big characters like Tom Walkinshaw and Flavio Briatore, and they were sort of hustling and okay, at the end, Michael basically only did 12 out of 16 races, don't he? If you take the disqualifications of Spa and Silverstone, there was that picture slightly skewed across 94. But you're right, Damon delivered an unbelievable drive in Suzuka to take the title to Adelaide, and then I was so glad that Damon got his 96 championship, because just for everything he did in 94, he deserved one.
I felt exactly the same way. I think that a lot of people would have done as well. So I think you summed it up nicely. It does define the mid-90s, actually, for F1. Before Mika Hakkinen gets going, that we needed Damon, didn't we, basically? Right, well, number 4, I might have been sucked into a bit of a box office, been duped by box office numbers here, but I've got number 4, Niki Lauda versus James Hunt, which was not for very long. I don't think it was intense in terms of bashing each other off. That doesn't tick that particular box, but they did have some proper wheel-to-wheel fights. Obviously, first one in F1, really, people remember, will be 1975 Dutch Grand Prix when Hunt was still in the Hesketh. But then, I'd argue, if we were doing our greatest championship fights across a season, then 76 would be up there, wouldn't it? Just a dramatic, crazy campaign.
It would be, but would that campaign have been as tight if Lauda hadn't have had the crash at the Nürburgring?
No, absolutely
not. Because he'd won 7 races before that, or 6 or 7 races before that, hadn't he? So, to me, I want to put this as high, only because I don't think it had the intensity or the hatred that you got with a lot of the other rivalries on this list. I don't think you got as much of the off-track needle. Yeah, okay, there was a disqualification and the reinstatement, and
It was almost the
Brands Hatch.
teams that were more needly, wasn't it, than the drivers?
Yeah, but I think you got sucked into the Rush, the Rush movie.
I can't claim to have the excuse of having written it near when the film was out. The film was out for absolutely ages, so yeah, just got sucked into that one. I mean, where would you put it? Is out of interest? Would you be? Are we talking 6, 7?
Yeah, I would go further down because I think it's popular, right? People know about Hunt versus Lauda.
It is genuinely iconic.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of our responsibility as those experts in the field to look beyond the hype and try and actually look a bit more deeply into it. And to me, if Lauda hadn't have had that crash, he would have blitzed 76 by a country mile, and then they wouldn't really have had a championship fight.
That is true. I agree with your previous comment as well. But I would also say that the Japanese Grand Prix, or that end to 1976, did bring F1 to a wider, bigger audience than if you just had Lauda reeling off 10 wins in a second world title. So I think it is one that does belong in that sort of history of F1 because of its importance, if that makes sense.
I'd give you 10th.
Okay. Oh, he's let it slot in. Fair enough. I don't think we're going to have too much debate about the top 3 needing to be in here. Maybe the order, but number 3, Mark Schumacher versus Mika Häkkinen. I think you've got the best driver of his era and possibly the fastest going at it in very equal cars for a few years, and that was just mega, wasn't it?
It was brilliant. I think that's such a rare thing for us to have had in the sport, really, and I think that's why you'd have to say the top 3 that we're looking at is probably the only 3 where we had that for a period of time, not just 1 year like Alonso and Hamilton, for example, or Alonso Schumacher. This was a genuine rivalry that, let's not forget, went back to 1990 in Formula 3, where they were racing and collided at the end of the Macau Grand Prix. Schumacher finishing with his rear wing hanging off and Häkkinen in the barrier, throwing his gloves on the ground. The rivalry went back to there. So, and it sort of bubbled along a little bit because while Mika, had uncompetitive McLarens, it didn't really implode. And then, of course, come Newey and the 1998 McLaren, it's there. And it was fantastic. It was just, for me, the Japanese Grand Prix qualifying of 2000.
Oh, I was going to say that same thing.
it epitomizes this thing, doesn't it? Because these two were just on a different level to their teammates and really chasing perfection. And it was proper edge of your seat stuff. You'd sit there watching every qualifying, every race, thinking, this is amazing quality stuff.
Yeah, it was. I've been looking this up recently for a separate piece, but 9,000ths of a second between them in the end. But it was one of those where one would go out and go a little bit quicker, and then quicker, and it was just phenomenal. But I think their races were a little bit like that as well in terms of some of them. Actually, that race, that day, was just like qualifying laps for a race distance, and they absolutely obliterated the field. I guess where it falls down compared to maybe the top 2 on our list, not actually as many direct wheel to wheel. So they were racing each other in championships. There's 2 all championships across that 4-year period, but there aren't many. Okay, there's Spa, there's the Häkkinen Pass at Spa, but actually usually wheel to wheel Michael had the edge, and there weren't that many moments that you remember in the way that perhaps we'll get to on the top 2 of our list. I think that's fair. I think it took Häkkinen a long time to raise Schumacher.
Yeah, I think so. You'd have to say it was almost like Michael had more wheel-to-wheel ding-dongs with David in that era, didn't he?
Yeah.
It was a bit weird, but it's just the way it shook out. But I think you had these sort of season-long intense battles building along. And really, you'd have to say, even 99, with Schumacher missing half the season, he was a big player in that whole story, wasn't he? You think of Malaysia, where he came and he was just winding Mika up by blocking him and holding him back so Irvine could win the race and all this sort of stuff. Michael had a big part to play even in the 99 season. And but I mean, 2000, I feel like 2000, especially the season decider in Suzuka, kind of goes under the radar as one of the all-time great races because there was no big crash or there was no big overtake or whatever. But I think therefore it goes on the radar. But actually, in terms of sheer quality of driving from two of the very best world champions we've had, it's got to be one of the best.
Oh, I totally agree. Totally agree. That's good, isn't it? We're in agreement
Yeah.
with the top end of the list. Right, so number two, I'm not going to do the two together. I think it's going to be fairly obvious what number one is really. But number two is Nigel Mansell versus Nelson Piquet. Actually, I mean, they were both in F1 together for quite a long time, but really it's on this list because of their 2 years at Williams and how Mansell won more races, got more poles, and somehow didn't win a title across either season, but Piquet did.
I mean, Mansell gets a bit of a bad rap, doesn't he, in some ways, because, he's a divisive character. I think there's people around in his era who, for whatever reason, didn't warm to him. I'm saying people within the sport, as much as the public absolutely loved him, you'd argue more than they've loved any driver. As much as Lewis has his fans and all the rest of it, people really loved Nigel, didn't they?
Like, track invasions and stuff.
All of that stuff. And he was the people's hero. But I think people forget how good he was because you have to factor in the weight. He was driving in an era where the driver weight was treated separately from the car. Now, he was carrying, because he was bigger built and taller, he was carrying probably a 3/4 deficit per lap over Senna and Prost at that time. And he was right up there. He was a match for them on a lot of occasions. So I think Nigel kind of goes underrated a little bit, I think, in that respect. And certainly in the terms of this rivalry, Piquet completely didn't rate him, did he? When he rocked up at Williams in '86, he absolutely didn't rate him. And all of a sudden, Nigel's there, delivering and winning races and is incredibly fast and pushing him hard. And then Piquet went to his old tricks of just playing the games and, using the press to call Nigel all sorts of names and said some pretty horrendous things about his wife and all sorts. And it was a really nasty rivalry.
Yeah, and I was looking at this, breaking it down. 86, where, I mean, actually this is a lesson for McLaren now, isn't it? They took points off each other so much that Alain Prost obviously won the championship and Mansell had his blowout. But in that year, he did still beat Piquet in the championship, even though they're incredibly close, both in qualifying and race pace. Actually, I've been through all the numbers and it's nothing. But then the moment that Piquet rattles himself at Tamburello in 87, he really can't see which way Mansell's gone most of that season, and yet he ends up winning that world championship. It's really bizarre.
Nigel was really unlucky, wasn't he?
Wheel nut falling off at Hungary and silly things like that.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, of course, through the 80s, they all had DNFs from reliability problems. Of course they did. And I haven't done this recently, but I remember a few years ago we were looking back with our friend Jonathan Williams, actually, from Williams, and we had a discussion of how many championships could Nigel have won at Williams. And actually, I think we were sort of looking at the number of reliability issues or bad luck issues he had. And he definitely had more than the others, I think, in that window, if you look at from 85 until the end of 91, really. There's a strong case for him having won 86, 87 and 91, the World Championship.
I think it would be hard to argue that the right person didn't win the championships in 86 and 91. I think Alain Prost and Ayrton in those respective years probably were the best drivers in the world. 87, I do struggle to think that really that should have been any one of Prost, Senna's or Mansell's really, rather than Piquet's. Yeah. I suppose the iconic image of those two is Silverstone, isn't it? Which is another one where Mansell came out on top of.
And you'd have to say that's still got to be it's got to be one of the top British Grand Prix ever, isn't it? Just such a fantastic race, home winner, coming out on top. It's got to be right up there with, one of Mansell's greatest wins, maybe the greatest, really, in terms of defining. By the way, as a bit of a sidebar, I spoke to Zach Brown, who owns the car from the 87 British Grand Prix.
He's just restored it, isn't he? He's got it up and running, yeah.
He's going to demo it at the Grand Prix this year. He's bringing it back to Silverstone. So I love Zach for that. He loves the history as much as we do, and he's going to show it off.
He's got to do a little shimmy down the Hanger Straight in the coming down. He's going to have to prime him on that one.
There's got to be some sort of AI which we can, pretend to have a virtual Piquet alongside him.
It's on the Silverstone Museum one, isn't it? At the end, when you go into the do the lap, they've got that.
You can do the dummy and do the pass.
Well, I don't think it's anyone who knows anything about Formula One will be surprised by number one. It's Ayrton Senna versus Alain Prost. I mean, could it be anyone else? Really?
No, because of the length of the rivalry and
the intensity. I think.
Yeah, because the length and the intensity for that length of time. Because really, it was amazing. Even with Prost not in the car in '92, they managed to have some spectacular battles at the press, and so really it kicked off. You'd have to say Imola '89. '88 was relatively peaceful, wasn't it? And then
there's Estoril, wasn't there? That was but I mean now that looks small beer. But at the time there were a few comments written there how close Ayrton pushed down into the wall at Estoril. But 18.
Yeah, but if you look at it, they go to the podium and Suzuka '88, and they're still holding hands, and all that sort of stuff. And I think Prost sort of almost consoled himself with the fact that actually he'd scored more points in '88, and it was that ridiculous drop score system, really, that meant that Senna was world champion that year. But Imola '89 is where it imploded, and then it carried on all the way until late in '93, wasn't it?
Yeah, and even to the point of, as you say, when Prost wasn't in it, Senna would be complaining that he's written into the contract, I can't join Williams next year.
He called him a coward, didn't he?
Yeah, and you're like, but why do you think that might be?
Yeah.
It's like he welcomed you with open arms in '88. He learnt his lesson by then.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously we've talked about clashes as well. I mean, the '89 Suzuka and '90 Suzuka. I do get slightly annoyed with Senna fans. Like, oh yeah, Prost did that as his one-off thing that he did in his entire career. I don't think he's quite on the same level as Senna's taking Prost out at the start of 1990.
And I think for me, why this is and will always be the number one is because you are absolutely talking about the two best drivers of the era. There was not a shadow of a doubt that between, you'd say, even 1983 and 1993, for a decade, they were the two best drivers of that decade. And the fact that they came head-to-head in a championship battle in equal cars, once in the same team, once in two different teams, that just doesn't happen for that length of time.
Well, without the other, whoever's left would have racked up Mark Schumacher or Lewis Hamilton type numbers in terms of championships. But in a way, it's better for us that they didn't, because we had far more fights and rivalries as a result. So you're happy with the number one? Yeah,
but I think people often forget how it ended, in the sense they actually reconciled, didn't they, in '94? And I think I know Prost in particular feels. I think the Senna movie, and there's a whole load of legacy things that have come out, which is focused on the rivalry. And I know Alain in particular feels. It's a shame that the fact that they actually, once he retired, the pressure came off, and they did reconcile, and they sort of kissed and made up, and they started to become genuine friends in the final sort of 3 months once the intensity had gone away. It's a bit of a shame for Prost, I think.
Yes, I think it says quite a lot about Senna's character. He'd had Prost there pretty much his entire career, and he has the target, the guy I have to beat. And then in '92, when he wasn't there, obviously Mansell had the FW14B, so it was still something to strive for. And then suddenly Prost was gone, and he must have felt that the target was on his back, because this young German kid's coming. So it changed the dynamic, which I imagine sort of hastened that mellowing towards Prost.
Yeah, exactly that. But yeah, no doubt about it. I think that's got to be the number one.
Well, there we go. We're agreed on the number one, even if there was some, I do take your point about Lauda Hunt, but Senna versus Prost, I think a definite number one. But let us know what you think. What rivalries have we missed out or misplaced? Drop me a line, autosport@autosport.com. Thank you very much to Karun for joining us. Thanks very much to listeners. We'll be back soon with another Autosport Top 10.